Everybody, my name is Schengili-Roberts, and the presentation I'll be giving for you is, as you see here, it's called "Structured Content is Dead. Long Live Structured Content," sort of echoing the King is dead, long live the king. Uh, this might be over egging things just a little bit in terms of the title, but what I will be talking at least, I will be talking a little bit about how structured and unstructured content has been changing and evolving, and some of my thoughts as to where I think it's going to be going. So, without further ado, and by the way, I should say that I tend to overstuff my presentations. Anybody who's been to my presentations know that I tend to have a lot of slides, and that's no different here. So I may be speaking somewhat quickly, but hopefully I'll still be able to provide you the sort of in-depth material that I'm hoping that people listening to the presentation have come here for. So here's the agenda. I'm not gonna go over it. You can read, so that's fine. At this point, if those of you who are not familiar with me, my name is Keith Schengili-Roberts, sometimes Keith long name. I've recently joined Precision Content as a content specialist and information architect. I'm also a member of the OASIS DITA Technical Committee, and I would also urge people to, if you can, stick around for the presentation near the end of the day where Chris Everlin, who is the chair of the OASIS DITA Technical Committee, where she's going to be presenting a presentation on where DITA is today. Again, I've already seen it. Definitely worth attending if you have the time. I'm also the chair of the DITA Adoption Committee, where we try to promote the use of DITA. I'm also a professor, non-faculty, I should add, professor of information architecture at the University of Toronto. And I suspect most people here would be familiar with me as the writer behind DITAWriter.com. And what is DITAWriter.com? Well, as I say here, I like to think of it as kind of a nexus for DITA-related information, and it features such things as interviews, information for those who are just starting to work with the standard. Of course, it being a blog, there's information on, like my own thoughts about what I think the current state of DITA is. And over the past few years, it's for a niche publication. It's garnered a lot of hits, over 367,000. So I guess I'm doing something right. I also tend to list companies that are using DITA. In fact, I'll be talking about the latest information, which I've actually not yet posted to the site, but will be done fairly soon. Also, information on aid technical writers and on things like DITA jobs that are close to them. And I also want to say, hey, it's independent. There's no ads as well. So I mean that maybe that'll change if somebody makes it worth my while. But to be honest, I like the idea of it being a fully independent thing. So that's that for now is the state of things. And of course, I need to mention that I do in fact work for Precision Content, and Precision Content, essentially they understand that the information is a lifeblood of every modern organization, and yet most silently struggle with antiquated processes and technology to create and manage the information. You need information that's easier for everyone to use so that the right information flows freely through the organization to anyone at any time and anywhere it is needed. We believe that everyone should have the right information to make the best use of your product and services. We understand that poor content has a negative impact on your business, which is why we help companies like yours traverse digital transformation through better content, technology, and processes. And if you want to learn more, you just do a search for Precision Content, and you will find us. All right, so starting into this, Adobe asked me to speak about the future of technical communications, and I think at heart I am, I'm really not the futures. As I have, here's an award. You can, by the way, you can actually buy this online if you want. You can actually get a worst futurist award, and I think I might have to get that for myself. I'll have to check back on how I did with this presentation a couple of years hence. And I do think that skeptics make poor futurists, because we look at the information. We want to see. We don't just want to see arguments presented. I for one want to see data that backs up those arguments. So that's something that I've always tried to strive for in my own researches into finding out how data and structured content is being used. So basically what I plan to do is provide you essentially with a survey of what we currently know and highlight what seem to be some likely and near-term industry trends. And in terms of predicting the future, if 2020 has demonstrated nothing else, it's just shown how unpredictable things can be. Thank you very much, COVID. Yeah. All right, now in terms of explaining the title for this talk, I don't think structured content is necessarily dead. It's certainly in its old form, but I do think that we're going to see some significant changes in how it's going to be put to use. The same technologies that are being used on structured content, such as chatbots and IA that Vivek mentioned in his presentation a few minutes ago, are also being applied to unstructured content, and will have an impact there as well. And it's also worth pointing out, and I don't think many people realize this, that unstructured content may not be as unstructured as you think it is. And I also want to say that I do agree with the general opinion that out there that using data is ultimately a niche market. But boy, what a niche market! And you'll actually get to see something in terms of the size of the actual market that data reaches out to. And another thing is that I also find that futurists rarely talk about the past. It's but I think it's important to know about where we've come from in order that we have a better idea as to where I think we may be going and why. So with that, I'm now going to do a little short history of technical writing, and I'm going to go way back here, so about as early as you can go. I mean, there's always been a need to instruct people on how to do practical things. So there are ancient Egyptian medical and mathematical papyri, for example. There's if you ever go to the Neue Museum in Berlin, there is a lovely collection of ancient Egyptian medical and mathematical papyri that you can actually see displayed, and without a doubt, this is there to instruct the would-be architects of the day as to, and physicians to as to what they needed to do. There's also ancient Greek philosophical works that talk about this, Roman engineering texts, and medieval instructional publications. And by the way, now this is almost certainly something English literature people out there may not have studied in college or university, but the first instruction manual is widely considered to be Chaucer's A Treatise on the Astrolabe. Not, to be fair, something as popular as, say, the Wife of Bath story, but it is nevertheless there. Written back in English in 1391, addressed to his own son. Sadly, incompleted, and the thought is that, and sadly, he may have actually perished before he actually had a chance to finish the full explanation. So if you're looking to learn about the astrolabe in full, you're probably going to have to go to a different source. But anyways, but again, the point behind this is that there has always been a need to instruct people on how to do things. So up until the earliest 20th century, manuals tended to focus on techniques, often including aspects of things like self-improvement. And believe me, if you've ever had a chance to look at some of these old documents, and they are largely available on things like you can take a look at archive.org, and Gutenberg, Project Gutenberg also has a bunch of these things. That's certainly where I've been able to do my research into this area. They tend to have a lot of anecdotes and were very often prescriptively moralistic, and came with a suggestion on how to become a better person who could fly, swim, and or behave. And then later on, we get to the beginnings of what we would consider more modern technical writing. It really started in the early 20th century, focusing on instructing people on how to work with technology, because it was not necessarily intuitive anymore. The Model T manual from 1919, it's now 101 years old, is a very good example of this. And again, that's available if you want to have a look at it. Joseph Chaplin wrote the first computer manual for the BINAC back in 1949. And you should keep in mind that these things tended to be written by a single person, more often than not what we would call a subject matter expert. They tended to be very idiosyncratic, and were often one-offs. And if you have a chance to look at the BINAC manual, believe me, it is idiosyncratic. So then we have the beginnings of structured authoring, and much of structured content ultimately derives from studies done by the U.S. Army and Navy back in the 50s and 60s as they were seeking more effective documentation. Because basically, if you are somebody who is under fire, you don't want to, open to page one of the manual and say, have it say, thank you very much for purchasing this rifle. We hope it sees you in good. It's like, no. How do I unjam? It's like, oh, blah, 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 blah. So you want to find the information you want, quickly and easily so that you can do the job that you need to do. And this is where the idea of typed modular information begins to come to the fore. And this is also where the idea of information mapping comes in. This was designed to provide quick and easy access to information at the right level of detail to readers. It introduced the idea of writing modular structure and content. So a block is essentially limited to a single topic, and blocks are grouped into maps. And anybody using DITA, does that sound familiar? Yeah, it definitely should. It's interesting, the subcommittee behind DITA examined several models for such things as business documents, and one of the models they looked at was, in fact, information mapping. This was developed by Robert Horn back in the 60s, but the subcommittee did not forward any formal proposals for adoption. So essentially, a DITA topic type is an instantiation of an information type. And precision content is a modern adaptation of the methods taught by Information Mapping International, though it is not necessarily, it is not affiliated or endorsed by it. And in terms of applying precision content to unstructured content, you can, almost at a glance see the advantages. What you have here, like on the left, we have material from a manual that is talking about how to treat cancer. And essentially, what we've been able to do is to transform that content into something that is much more easily readable and digestible on the right-hand side, because it strives for clarity, consistency, conciseness, and focuses on easily digestible blocks of content. And essentially, the comprehension level for reading the material on the right-hand side of the screen is perhaps unsurprisingly much higher than what you get on the left-hand side of the screen. So that is really the core of what we do at Precision Content. What I'm hoping, a lot of this is essentially considered best practice within structured authoring. Now, another thing to think about is, back in the 80s, we need to think of the rise of desktop publishing. And, this is non-structured content, but it essentially allowed for the creation of content quickly and easily. And over time, it was possible to output content in various formats, including things like PDF and web. So this is really sort of what I think is the beginning of the unstructured versus structured content dichotomy. Basically, looking at ease of use and relatively low overhead versus significant value add, but higher upfront processing that is needed by taking a structured approach. And I think in some ways it's possible to say that this is a path that modern users of Markdown have also taken. It's essentially a blank slate with a low overhead approach. However, the key difference is, between that and what you're looking at here with this early, first version of Microsoft Word is that, there's also, you have to take open source processing and procedures in the picture, and also the more collaborative nature. So there are some other things that come into play here, but essentially we're still looking at an unstructured approach when you're looking at things like Markdown, but less so than what you might get with an early version of Word like this. And again, looking back, more on the history, 90s era IBM faced two main documentation issues. So they needed their content to be tailored to the web, and they found that they were just having to deal with too many outputs, needing lots of different tools. So they then created an XML-based topic-type documentation standard, which they called DITA. This is where one topic equals one web page. That was, again, the original intent of the topic. And they made it an open standard so that they could then benefit from sharing the information with their business partners. So the DITA Open Toolkit opened up multi-channel publishing. And DITA has in turn evolved. The current version, of course, is DITA 1.3, moving to DITA 2.0 like sometime next year, probably the end of the year. And start out with 3 topic types: concept, task, and reference. And again, talking about precision content, we actually add 2 additional topic types: process and principle. And I'll get into an example of that in a moment. I also want to talk about, also mention that I think there's also some real promise in the idea of lightweight DITA. And I think one of the key things there is not only the simplicity, sort of scaling back a lot of the perceived complexity of DITA, but again, one of its key strengths, perhaps a superpower, if you will, is the idea that it inbuilt is the idea to be able to share content easily and quickly. So that I think is one of the core things that will help sell the idea of lightweight DITA to a broader audience. And in terms of information type examples, the first 3 should be fairly familiar to anybody who is familiar with DITA. So if the goal of the information is to, say, list the nutritional facts for a cherry cola, hey, that's what you would put into a reference topic. If you want to explain what a soft drink actually is, well, that would go into a concept topic. If you want to instruct on how to safely open your can of cola, well, that's where you would want to use a task. Where precision content comes in, we come in with a couple of other different topic types. One is called process, and that would then, in this particular instance, in this sort of a case study, so to speak, or example, it looks at more like more at how it illustrates how cola would, say, be bottled. And a principle would, basically would be, in this case could be, warn you not to drop a Mento into your cola bottle, and why. So again, that provides a a brief overview as to the other types of topics that we also think is important. So now that's the past, and you can also tell that also sort of talks a little bit to where we are today. And there's unstructured content and there's structured content, and they're both vying for, I don't want to say supremacy, but they're both in the game together, and they need, I think, to mutually coexist. And it's worth pointing out that most content out there today is in fact unstructured content. There is a Gartner study widely referenced that says that roughly 80% or more of all enterprise data / content is in fact unstructured. And what's the world's most popular writing tool to from the early from the 80s to today? Hey, it's Word, and it's still Word. I sometimes find that incredible that there are many technical writers who are only using Word and perhaps not getting it as and not using it for just transferring information. But that is in fact still the case today. So structuring content is the solution to making unstructured content more usable, right? Right? I mean, that is one of the traditional arguments, but I would say that honestly, I don't think the path is quite so clear cut as that. Partly because I think it's perhaps not as well known that unstructured content has more structure in it than you may realize. What you see here is an example of MS-XML, which is built into the earlier versions of Microsoft Office. These days, actually, it's just easier to show some sample code from that than the more modern material from Microsoft OpenXML, which was introduced in the 2010s. But the point being is that if you in fact are using Word or Excel or any other Office application, you are in fact inadvertently perhaps writing in XML. And it's worth noting that the information that is there is used and can be extracted for use in other applications, such as chatbots. I mean, of course, Microsoft has their own particular implementation of a chatbot that can be used with Teams, and it works primarily with Office content, which is unstructured, but maybe, as I say, not as unstructured as you may think. So, while it doesn't separate content from formatting per se, you can see from this, early example here, it does contain a semblance of structure. Similarly, image and video files come with a substantial amount of metadata content. Um, Whenever you take a picture on your phone, for example, there's information on it. Not just saying what the name of the file is, but more often than not, location information, authoring information like who took the picture, date and time, and a whole bunch of other related information. I typically, when I'm teaching information architecture, I typically take a look at, take a picture and let's have a look at the metadata. And it is, literally, a couple of pages worth of material. So it may not be considered traditionally structured, but it has a lot of useful semi-structured content, if you want to put it like that. This does provide useful information on when, where, and who created the content. So now let's have a look at who is using it. So this is the latest information that I've been able to discern from my survey of companies that are using DITA, and this is from a count of 756 firms that are known to be using DITA. And essentially, it's worth pointing out that it shouldn't be a huge surprise that the single largest sector, industry sector that is using DITA is and has been since the beginning the computer software sector. Is still, as you can see here, the single largest group of DITA users. It's worth noting that many of the other industries mentioned here are also using DITA when documenting their software. So, many of the clients I've been to over the past decade who are using DITA, it may in fact be, say, the end user tech pubs publishing unit, but it may, more often than not, it's also the software division within, a traditional telecom firm, a semiconductor firm, a medical device firm, financial services. There are things with, there are uses within DITA that can be leveraged very easily within for use, I should say, within documenting things like computer software. Having said all that, as you can see here, the DITA use is widespread and still seeing overall growth. In particular, the other slice here, the one that's that's a 12%, it keeps growing, emphasizing that there really is widespread growth. And you can see that basically this is essentially, if you take a look at the material just before it, you can see that it breaks down to very thin slices of 1%, and other essentially it includes organizations that would essentially be like a point of a percent, but there's a lot of them. So as I say, DITA usage is, rather interestingly widespread. So I think it's also worth now looking at which firms actually get the most benefit from using DITA. And as you can see here, now what I've done is I've taken all of those firms you've seen from the previous slide, and I've been able to essentially classify them as to what is their the size, the number of employees that they employ. So what you can see here is that overwhelmingly, almost 2/3 are, of firms using DITA are, what we would call large firms, with 500 or more employees. And, essentially they get the largest benefits from going down the path of DITA. The types of efficiencies that DITA brings work best on scale. And another example about, again, pointing out how large this life. So one thing is, of course, looking at the number of employees. Then another thing is, in terms of looking at those same firms in terms of the annual revenue. So again, looking at that, thinking about that big slice from before, it's again communicated here, 60% of what we would consider large firms that earn between 100 million to $1 billion plus a year. Those are the ones that are, primarily using DITA. And by the way, if you're interested, this particular information is derived from Hoover's financial database of companies. So these are the companies who are using DITA. And, again, I want to emphasize that DITA appears to work best at scale. So then the obvious question is, well, who is not using DITA? And it's worthwhile pointing out, this should come to no surprise to anybody who is using any form of structured content, be it DITA, be it S1000D, what have you, that structured content requires an investment of time and money. The benefits are worth it, but they may not be apparent or obvious at first. It may, in fact, be a lot easier in the short term for firms to go with a non-structured approach. And more often than not, what the common story is that they take this approach, and then 1 or 2 or 3 years down the line, they realize that without having the benefits of particularly things like content reuse, that they are running into some real growth issues. They find it hard to expand further without essentially redoing things that they've already essentially written before. Of course, the other one is smaller firms. And again, it's because there is not a lot of overhead when doing unstructured content. And if you're a relatively small firm, and again, small being under 500 people, but again, think about that. A tech docs team may be just one person. In which case, even if there is an argument for content reuse, if it's just the one person who is writing the content, they have a good idea as to what content that they can potentially reuse down the road. Now, of course, that is an issue should the company grow. But again, the point being is that again, from what you've seen, structured content / DITA is used primarily in larger firms, and smaller firms do not reap the same amount or type of benefit because they're not working at scale. And having said all that, I think it's worth pointing out that many firms, including many of the in fact, definitely specifically a lot of the large firms out there, adopt a hybrid approach. I find it actually rare to find a large firm that is using DITA exclusively. Now, that's not to say that there's another division that may be using Word to publish manuals. That may in fact well be the case. But quite often what I'm finding is that there is DITA that's being used perhaps by the tech docs and or the software department, but there may in fact be a mix where they're in fact using, like another department may in fact be using Markdown, or perhaps Confluence or some other unstructured tool. And they're, what's interesting is how some companies are beginning to look at round tripping material from, say, Markdown to DITA and DITA to Markdown using an intermediary like lightweight DITA for Markdown. Now, I think DITA's primary superpower has to be, essentially its content reuse. The design decision to make DITA content reusable ended up being the standard's real superpower. None of the other major XML doc standards, such as DocBook or S1000D, emphasize this. Now, I think DocBook more recently has looked into this, but again, it's not like core to it. And this is what's really enabled the initial business success of DITA. And I think what the chief business strengths of DITA are is that these are the reasons that these are reasons that most people with even a passing familiarity of DITA ought to be familiar with by now. So the idea of content reuse, lower localization costs, content formatting separation. I mean, you no longer have to spend time readjusting all the headers. If you bump one level up, it's all just done for you automatically. That actually can save considerable time. And of course, the idea of multi-channel publishing. You can just take one form of content and you can then output it to whatever format is appropriate for your organization's needs. Having said all that, and like I was saying, I think this is, I've talked about these particular benefits many times at other conferences, but I think it's also worth mentioning some of the less obvious benefits of DITA that's worth calling attention to. And it's also worth pointing out that it can also be put towards the following: to advance products' search engine optimization, provide a better overall customer experience. And it's also interesting to know that, and again, this is one of the things that precision content is really well known for, is topic and semantic structure really does seem to work well with emerging systems such as chatbots. Now, this is by design, but not in the way that the founders of DITA would have originally thought. Single sourcing, content reuse, and more efficient localization are all great, but it's because of topic typing and the user focus of well-written DITA that we're seeing other opportunities like these ones opening up. So it's worth mentioning that customer experience has really become what I think is basically a business imperative. So before digital transformation, key business interactions were with customers happened in the physical world. There were many key touch points users and customers would encounter, such as, marketing might provide something like a data sheet detailing the features of a product. Sales would then give additional supporting information. And once a product was purchased, you could then get the fine manual that you would then hopefully read as a consumer. And if there were issues post-purchase, you would contact support and sales, and they would then help you with their product. But then our customers moved online, and we moved from what had formerly been a physical, we moved what had formerly been physical content as well. So since users could then choose the specific information they were looking for, it was easier to completely skip parts of the customer experience which did not directly answer the types of questions users or customers were asking. So sales information often didn't match what users were actually seeking, and users would not actually get to the phone call to support and services stage if other options were available first. So in this scenario, technical documentation has come to the fore, since it's more often contains information that prospective customers are actually looking for. And again, I think the next slide will also emphasize this. So here is what you see here is Google's 4 user moments from a document they published a few years ago. In this case, I want to focus on the first and third moments. The first moment highlights that 65% of online consumers look up more information now than ever. And notice that the picture shows someone looking up information, on their smartphone. This experience is highlighted in the third moment, where Google finds that 91% of smartphone users turn to their phones when doing a task. So the key thing here is that the majority of all searches have moved to mobile devices, and these 4 moments summarize the 4 most popular types of questions that people are making. And these 2 Google moments adapt well to the types of content technical communicators provide who are using DITA. And by the way, full credit to Joe Pearman, who first noticed this relationship. I'm simply using and expanding upon it here. So given this, is it any wonder that DITA-based tech docs can dominate search engine results? So there's an imperative to provide more customer-focused information, both from a marketing and a technical documentation perspective. And partly by design and partly by accident, DITA is being recognized as being pivotal to this. And now we look at the idea of chatbots and AI. So this subject has been getting a lot of interest in marketing tech docs these days. And while I still think we're very much in the early days, it's likely to become another facet in the overall customer experience journey. I don't think it's going to replace tech docs, far from it, but I think it's definitely going to be a complementary mechanism. So how does DITA-based tech docs fit in this sort of scenario? Well, chatbots take one of 2 paths when working with external content, including technical content. So it digests existing material, which it then incorporates directly within itself, or it refers to appropriate material a user wants via metadata, which is embedded into the DITA, the structured content that is DITA. Either way, having tech docs in a structured format like DITA makes it easier for chatbots to digest or find content to reference, because well-defined content types plus descriptive metadata makes it easier for chatbots to use. And in terms of integrating DITA content with chatbots, you need to think of them as a new complementary channel for content delivery that works best with, not solely, but best with structured content. DITA definitely has a role here, not directly in the chatbot conversation. That's a whole other writing experience involving how to write conversations, and that's not something that tech docs focuses on. But it does, instead it provides technical content when and where it's needed. So in the short term, from a tech docs perspective, as I say, it's likely to be rolled out as a complementary platform for answering users' queries. And from a business perspective, it makes sense to be cautious in how this is deployed. In fact, most chatbots are in fact being deployed internally within companies to answer things like information that an employee may have, say, about their pension benefits, just things like that. HR related stuff as one example. Then posting it externally. Usually, the idea is they want to make sure they understand how the technology works before they go customer focused. But again, that's again why you want to get this sort of thing right when you're moving content via chatbots to the public. Now, again, I want to point out that this story is not cut and dry. It's not to say that unstructured content is the be all. Structured content is the be all when it comes to working with AI and chatbots. Far from it, because AI is being applied to unstructured content as well. So IBM Watson can be applied to both unstructured and structured content. And IBM notably calls AI the key to making unstructured data useful. And it's not just IBM who's saying this. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and others are all producing tools for analyzing unstructured content, images, and audio data. Now, again, it's still early days, but it's worth noting that AI and chatbots are not being used exclusively with structured content. But having said that, it does take at this point something like the power and ability of a Watson to be able to effectively crunch this information and to make it usable. So, in some ways, not surprisingly, it's a lot easier from a large business perspective to write in structured modes so that this information can be more easily disseminated without having to call upon the raw brain power, so to speak, of systems like Watson. But again, as with Moore's law in terms of processing, this sort of thing over time will become more and more common when applying this sort of thing to unstructured content. So I do think the two are likely to go, hand in hand. You will see AI and chatbots applied, maybe not equally. We'll see what happens, but it will be applied to unstructured as well as to structured content. And now I'm getting close to the end. I'm just going to talk about what I think are some likely near-term trends. And I want to point out that, since late 2012, I've been checking the details for technical writer, in quotes, job postings on Indeed.com, which is the US's largest job post aggregator website. And over the past 8 years, there's been an overall decline in the number of technical writer job postings on that website. Roughly 1,000 fewer job postings across the U.S. than from its peak in the fall of 2015. And I hope it doesn't surprise people that in the era of COVID, things have taken a further dive. And one of the reasons I think is that SMEs are in fact now producing more upstream content. So when it comes to things like, for example, API docs, programmers are expected to provide a lot of the content. This is often framed and put into context later by technical writers. Also, the advent of agile documentation processes in smaller software development teams means that in some circumstances, SMEs also, more or less had to write the content because, it's too small for them to rely on. There's no other option, put it that way. So that's one reason why I think there's less call for traditional tech writer jobs. And the other one is that I strongly believe this, that the role of technical writer is in fact changing. So in the survey I did of 1,500 LinkedIn profiles where people claim to be using DITA, fully 2/3 were not employed as traditional technical writers. Some of the selected job titles are, what you see here, content architect, information architect, lead information developer, senior content strategist, so on and so forth. I'll leave it for you to read. And keep in mind that a lot of this type of these types of jobs is not somebody who's sitting down to do the writing per se. They are there to help with things like structure. They are there to help with getting the content infrastructure, using as a content strategist, and deploying this more fully through an organization. And again, this I think speaks to the idea that structured content does have a type of, there is overhead that is required to do this properly, as you can see in many of these types of jobs. But for larger companies working at scale, it makes sense for them to have these roles because the efficiencies at the end of the day are worth it. And the last thing I really want to end here with is often I get questions as to where do I think DITA is in terms of the technology adoption life cycle. And this is what is that? Basically, it's the idea that there is a bell curve applied to any type of new technology that comes along. And there are basically, at the early stages, there are innovators, followed by early adopters, and then what's known as the early majority, followed by the late majority, and then laggards. And usually by the time we hit the late majority or laggards, there may in fact be another technology that may in fact overlap or come to the fore or be used in parallel. But having said all that, from what I've seen, I believe. Now, this is my prediction, and this is perhaps the one thing I'm doing as an actual futurist, but it is based on data. Essentially, this is and compared to other results of looking at other types of technology usage within companies, and I believe that we're still, believe it or not, in the early majority phase, but near the end of the early majority. So we're sort of getting near, but not actually at peak, what could be called peak DITA. There was a nice article in the best practices letter put out by CADM from an article, and the article was titled, "Are we living in a post-DITA world?" And I would say strongly, no, definitely not. That's not going to hit for some time. I would say possibly, post-DITA is going to be sometime in past the 2030s. But for right now and in the foreseeable future, I believe that this is where we are in terms of overall DITA adoption by as you can see, by primarily large companies. And having said that, well, that's all I got to say. And I realize I'm getting close to time here, but if in fact we do have any questions, I'm all for them. Probably one question.
Great job, Keith.
Thank you.
We do have a little bit of a delay with the questions. When we ask for questions, it takes just a second for the broadcast to catch up. So we'll have a few.
Okay.
But excellent as always. Lots and lots of content. Holy cow! People were trying to keep up, saying, "Wait, I missed that slide. I missed that slide." But always,
it's a lot of content, I realize.
Wonderful. Keep your slides up. I stopped the recording.